Welcome to this Let's Chat About Inclusive Education session. Our goal in these sessions is to introduce you to people across Canada who are doing interesting things to promote inclusive education in our schools. I'm Gordon Porter, the Director of Inclusive Education Canada, and I'm pleased to have my colleague Diane Richler here with me today. Diane is the chair of the Catalyst for Inclusive Education Initiative of Inclusion International, and she's a past executive vice president of Inclusion Canada. Our guest today is Lynn Aylward, who's a professor of education at Acadia University in Nova Scotia. And Lynn has been involved in inclusive education for a number of years and has recently done some things that are quite interesting, and we're going to talk to her about them today. Welcome, Lynn.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So tell us about this last activity that we want to talk a bit about today that you've been engaged with.
Yeah, so hopefully it's not my last activity, unless there's information that you have that I don't.
How about recent?
Yeah.
How about recent?
Recent's good. I'll go with recent. Yeah, it's the case of Luke Aylward. And I think maybe to start, what I find most interesting about it is the way that I came to the project. The case of Luke Aylward, which was a human rights charter challenge in Nova Scotia in the year 1986-87, started up during the time that I was in my Bachelor of Education degree at Acadia University. And while I was being taught by some of the key folks involved in that case, one being Dr. Margaret Brown. And being involved in inclusive education in various provinces and territories in Canada, I remembered that teaching and I remembered the significance of it. But when I moved back to Nova Scotia, I literally by accident met Rick Aylward and Luke through their business, their woodworking business. And I can remember the day I was in their house, picking up a piece of furniture, and Rick and I were chatting. Luke wasn't there. And he said something about, yes, well, as you know, I run this business with my son, Luke, and I just started to put the names together. And then he mentioned disability. And then all of a sudden I said, you're Luke Aylward's father. I think he must have thought, who's in my house? But yeah, so that kind of started me thinking about, whatever happened to this learning and this teaching and this incident and the fallout or maybe forward progression from that. And it always takes a while in academia for you to get your focus on the projects that you want to spend time on, I find the most. So in 2017 in Nova Scotia, we had quite a year. There was a lot of, tension between the public school teachers and the government, and inclusive education became a bit of a flashpoint. And you heard a lot of educators speaking to class composition and the problems of inclusive education and the under-resourcing. We can all appreciate these discourses have been around for a while. And I felt that, and I have felt for some time, that sometimes we forget why we even began to take down segregation. And I think perhaps sometimes we forget where it is we're going. And I mean that in all groups, I mean that in the family and the professional groups and academics and all of that. And so I thought maybe it's time to revisit the Luke Aylward case and think about that context and project into now and say, so 30 some years on, where are we? What does this mean? And what can we learn from it?
So that's where the film came in.
That is. So part of the project. Yeah, I have no shortage of data on this one because I have key informants like yourself, interviews, video. I have all of the work product from the school board side of the challenge to integrate Luke into elementary school. I have, just a ton of data, and out of that, one of the knowledge mobilization products was this small 22-minute film that took so much longer than any journal article. And I mean, some of that was just personal situations of the key people involved. Dr. Matt Rogers is my co-producer, co-writer, research partner. And, you know, life intervenes. So we did have a couple of delays, but we're happy with the story. And I guess I'm especially happy about Luke being hopefully seen as the anchor, as it should be.
So let's take a second and look at a couple of minutes from the film. We'll do that now. That's okay? Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing that with us, Lynn. And it's certainly, for me, it brings back memories. And as it happens, I haven't listened to that in a while, but you know, when a story like this gets on As It Happens in those days, that was a major bit of attention across the country.
Yeah, for sure.
Diane, you recall that?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, the case at the time was just such a mobilizer of attention and consideration. I mean, Luke was just this cute little boy. And I think you really see that from what you captured in some of the film. And you had, I mean, it really, the drama portrayed itself in terms of the school board being so afraid of letting this little kid into school and all of the energy that they put into it. But from the perspective of the associations of families of people with intellectual disabilities like Luke, it was seeing that the courts recognized that their dreams were not unrealistic and that in fact the law supported what their dreams were. So, you know, anybody who was working in the area of inclusive education in those days and even going forward, like Luke's name just is the symbol of victory of the law and just common sense over what was really fear by the school board. It wasn't malicious intent. It was really fear that they just didn't know, like, how are they going to include this cute little boy?
You know, it's interesting that you say this cute little boy, because I want to tell you a story, and I thought that's all you're going to hear from me is stories today. But when I was interviewing Wayne McKay, one of his comments was, and I've talked to Gordon about this as well, is that it was a perfect case. You know, and I flinched when I used the word case, and we used it in the title of the film, but on purpose, because so much of special education was about kids being cases, you know, psychological cases. But that's certainly not the way I view the world. But in this case, I mean, in this situation, I mean the legal case, just to be clear. But so I said, what do you mean by a perfect case? And he actually, you know, said, it's a compelling story. The family is, as Gordon says in the film, not agitating radicals. You know, we've got a fireman and a firefighter and you know, a mom who's worked in preschool and worked to integrate her community. He has a sister, and there's not one scary thing about Luke. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it kind of flips things around when you think about today. And all through the 80s, really, and 90s, where students had to earn their way into classes through mainstreaming of good behavior. So they had to get that ticket by not being, as you said, scary or different, or, you know, and how repressive is that? You know, so in some ways, you know, we pulled one over on the world in a sense, didn't we? Because we got some disability rights through this lovely, unassuming family. And yet I kind of think they are agitating radicals because, you know, as you see in the film, when you talk to Maureen, when you talk to Rick, they were resolute. They were determined. And I think there's no probably more determined people than parents looking out for their children.
So to what degree do you think educators, people engaged in this discussion about inclusive education in Nova Scotia today would have any sense of what happened more than 30 years ago with the Aylwards? Do you think they know about it? Are they aware?
No. And actually, I was just meeting with an academic librarian today, because one of the other projects we're going to do is to create, and Jackie Specht is involved in this because it will be located on the Canadian Research Centre for Research and Inclusive Education, an interactive resource to go alongside the film. So that it can be used for educational purposes, law, sociology, what I want it wide open. It'll be open license, go for it. But there's actually funding out to, in the library and archives groups to, I guess, promote untold hidden stories, right? Of groups that have been underrepresented. And certainly the disability community is underrepresented in the stories of our histories, our shared histories. There are many other groups as well, but it's, so I think this falls in that category of, the lawyers. When I talk to the lawyers, and I love to call Wayne McKay, every once in a while when Wayne McKay and I are talking, I'm like, I have to remember, Wayne, you're a lawyer, but they'll talk about it not being precedent in the legal sense, but it was it did set the tone, the policy, the future direction. It was the beginning of the house of cards falling on not listening to parents. So I don't think it has been recognized enough. And I do think there's a lot to be learned from examining the historical record.
It's interesting because, Wayne has certainly gained a national reputation and is now seen as very much the legal expert in this area. And so in a lot of ways, the decision was fundamental for Luke and for his families. But, my guess is that Wayne would say that it influenced his career a lot as well. And I think his perspective, because I don't think he had been involved in a case similar to that before. And I'm not sure he actually knew how much he knew about the challenges of a cute little kid being able to go to their neighborhood school.
Yeah, in my conversation with Wayne, and unfortunately, Blaise McDonald, who was his co-counsel, who's no longer with us, no longer alive, so hence he's not in the film. He would say he was a beginning scholar. He was an education law specialist for sure, but not necessarily disability and education law. And he was brought into it by Blaise. I mean, the story goes, here's another one for you. The CBC picked up CBC or local news picked up the first hearing, which was the hearing at the school board offices for an appeal of placement. And when that went to news the next day, Blaise McDonald heard it on the news and thought, I want to help this woman. I want to help this family. I want to help them do what's needed here. I think he has a connection in his family to disability in the community. I'm not sure what it is. And he thought, I really need an expert. You can imagine him. He couldn't really go to the Dalhousie website at the time. So maybe he went to some other location and looked for an expert and perhaps knew of Wayne and contacted him. I want to imagine it was a cold call. I don't know. And said, hey, I've got this going on. And I think this could be a big situation. They soon realized, or Wayne would say, that it could be a charter challenge, which was huge because the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982, started or was passed, but the challenges to specific articles within that charter were delayed. In
right. They only came into effect in 85.
Yes. So this was fresh, right? So that was appealing to on a curiosity and learning level. But then I would say Maureen would describe that as a tight, committed group. that fought that. And when you were there to witness it, she said she grieved the loss of that group afterwards, that they were like a family, because they spent so much time together over that year, right from the fall until June.
Tell us more about, you mentioned Margie Brown, and Diane and I both knew her well. And I'm sure Diane can add to the story a little bit here in a minute, but tell us more about Margie and maybe the small group that worked with her to support the Aylwards. What can you share about that?
Yeah, so you both know Margie, and I know her from working at Acadia she was my professor first. Then I worked at Acadia in 1996, part-time faculty, and then raced away again, came back as a faculty member in 2003. And I was hired into the position that Margie left when she retired. So, that's the connection there. But Margie knew Maureen from preschool circles before she had Luke. So this is the way it goes. Nova Scotia, I say there's 2 degrees of separation. You need to be kind. It'll all come back around. And they knew each other from preschool circles, and Maureen knew at that time, because of Margie's 2 sons, she may have had 1 son then, just Douglas. I don't know if she had Derek yet, that Margie was active in the integration of students with disabilities, of children with disabilities in the preschool setting. When she had Luke, because she had already had that connection with Margie, she contacted Margie and became active in what was called the Integration Action Network, community-based, grassroots, parents. You knew Margie Brown, you both know, it didn't matter what degrees she had. She was mom in charge first. She was a parent first in that community, in the disability community. And the rest of it, I feel, flowed from that. But she was in it from the beginning. Yeah. And before the case started, she was helping Maureen and coaching and working with Maureen on the school system, within the school system, because we're talking grade 3 for Luke. He'd already been through primary, grade 1, grade 2, and preschool. So she was a great resource just all the way through. And then, as you can imagine, with Wayne McKay and Blaise McDonald, having Margie Brown on that team, that would be a tremendous resource.
So Diane, maybe you can add here. Margie Brown was also Nova Scotia representative to CACL at that time, and you and I both worked with her. Can you recall how the National Association got linked with that group in Nova Scotia that were supporting the Aylwards?
Well, she certainly brought the case to national attention. And at that time, Dulcie McCallum, who has since moved to Nova Scotia, was working with us, and she became involved in trying to mobilize national support for what was happening in Nova Scotia. And so, the case was a huge focus nationally, although we weren't involved on a day-to-day basis the way the local people around Maureen and Rick were. We knew that this was incredibly important. And somehow the people involved were so positive that we knew they were going to win. It was just, we just knew that this was an incredible opportunity.
And people had, I think, in 1986, maybe a view of the implications of the charter that in the following years, we've sort of been less optimistic about whether the charter would suddenly remake practices in schools. It hasn't done it to the degree that we might have hoped. But at that time, we were very optimistic about cases like Luke's.
But I have a question for you, Lynn, because I've been working much more internationally lately, and I'm not as connected to what's happening across Canada. I've been really impressed as we've chatted about inclusive education to people in academia across the country at how many really progressive people there are. like yourself working in universities across the country. But I'm wondering if you can reflect on what you think the reaction was at Acadia among the rest of the Faculty of Education at this challenge, which was not only a challenge to a particular school board, it was a challenge to the way people in Nova Scotia were thinking that kids like Luke should be educated. And I'm wondering if you can sort of talk about that and then talk about how your students are reacting when they see the film now.
I think that at the time, I mean, in the 80s, when I was doing my Bachelor of Education, we actually had a really core group of folks working in special education at the time. That was the name, that was the degree. Don Little, Jack Went, you know, these folks were, as Don Little used to pride himself, he said, on getting kicked out of schools. They were challenging the system on a regular basis. So I think that Nova Scotia, Acadia University, was known nationally as a disability rights connected academic institution. I think that, you know, employers certainly thought that if you graduated from Acadia, you were not afraid of any students in terms of their learning needs or their learning, you know, their learning and a potential contribution. So I think it was, you know, Margie was well suited to the group that was here. And it was a very progressive group. Honestly, I will say, you know, 30 some years later, I don't think we have as progressive a group. First of all, we have less focus, you know, in terms of disability related work, for sure. You know, there was a large number of people involved in it from a variety of disciplines at that time. So although I'm happy that, of course, that inclusive education has, you know, broadened and created, you know, a much larger umbrella for sure in terms of diversity and equity. But I'm always reminded by Dr. Cynthia Bruce, my now former colleague, sadly, who went to Concordia University, who sits on the Education Standards Committee and has helped draft the accessibility legislation, and is a disabled scholar, that we need first voice there, and we need attention still, you know, in that field. So yeah, I think it seemed, you know, a slam dunk in many ways for Margie Brown to be doing that work at that time, and well supported, I hope, by her colleagues.
So Lynn, if you were asked by somebody from outside Canada, are Nova Scotia schools inclusive? What would your short answer be? So
my short answer would be, we definitely want them to be. I think professionally and from a community perspective, we're committed to that. I really do. I think that's what, in 1986, that's what people built on. You know, every child in that class, their parents wrote a note saying, we want Luke in the class, you know. I'm not sure, you know, that would be as uncomplicated today. And I would also say that we are working towards better definitions of what we mean by that, because we used to mean placement only, right? We used to mean just, you know, as I used to say, specials with regulars, whatever that meant. And so I think we've moved along in terms of programming and all of that. But this is not, you know, we've talked about this lots together, right? In many circles. It's not a destination, it's always the journey. And when we look at intersectionality, when we walk into rooms, we are not just one identity. So I think it's evolving. But you know, I'm always very hopeful, because I think that we've got some good people on it, and we're listening better, I hope. And that's what Luke Aylward's case taught us, to families and to communities that we need to listen to.
What about Nova
That's
Scotia?
My not so short answer. There you go.
Yeah, well, I know we could talk a long answer about that as well. But I want to just kind of probe a little something that I think, in terms at least of Atlantic Canada, Nova Scotia is a bit unique in that you have a fairly substantial African Nova Scotian population and an Indigenous population. And the regular school system is the primary deliverer of services. You have Francophones as well, but I think by and large, they have their own school system. So I don't know whether inclusion for them is the same issue. But that, in addition to disability, makes inclusion in Nova Scotia schools maybe a little more complex issue than it is in some other parts of rural or smaller, the smaller provinces of Canada. Can you reflect on that? What's it bring to the challenge that teachers and people like yourself face as a consequence?
So, Indigenous First Nations Mi'kmaq people in Nova Scotia have their own Education Act, right? And have decided that, colonial structures were too much and that they did want to have some control and self-determination in their education system. So they have, their own school system, right? Mi'kmaq Kinamatnui. And as you mentioned, the Francophone community has done the same. So we do see a situation where the public school, hasn't responded enough, I would say, to being responsive and open and flexible and making commitments to, to various communities and cultures. So for sure, it's complicated. I mean, quick story would be when we did the LINKS program, which looked at learning disability outreach with children in communities, and that was brought by partners with the Learning Disabilities Association of Nova Scotia and Department of Education to North Preston, historic Black community. It was necessary to involve people in that community to make that program, fit and make it more sensible and to make it, valid to that community group. So I think when we recognize that we have a long way to go on everything all the time, and that's what learning is, then we're going to get somewhere.
That's an encouraging note. I think, I mean, I guess I still hear from families in Nova Scotia who are their frustrations and their challenges are different from what the Aylwards were, because I think it's a lot easier for the kids to get into school. It's not necessarily so easy for them to be supported in school.
Agreed. Yeah.
And I guess I would be interested to hear your reflection on that. Sort of the Luke's case meant, yes, you have the right to be there, but how is the challenge of supporting kids being dealt with?
I think just like every education system across Canada, so I'll make this broad, I won't blame just my own home institutions, but if we invite diversity, we say everyone belongs here, everyone can participate, and we don't change the structure of the venue, and I mean that, substantially change the structure, then what are we really doing? We're just inviting people in to comply, right? Compliance. And that's what we saw, again, in mainstreaming and the beginning integration. It was as long as you could look normal, be okay, you were good to go. So I think we're still fighting that one, for sure. Lots of communities are, the disability community, absolutely, especially when we think about children with autism, families with any kind of, so-called behavioral norms that don't fit. Yeah, there's a judgment made and a value judgment made. That isn't fair, and it is in no way respectful of their human rights.
So I have a question. I do recall that Don Little was one of the very few Canadian writers that I recall reading his work and using it in papers I had to write in the 80s. So I'll just confirm that was my experience too, that Acadia had people who were considerably ahead of academics in other parts of the country. What about in the region now? Like, is there much of a networking between people like yourself in other Atlantic Canadian universities? And to what degree is that a factor in building the groundwork for inclusion in our schools?
Yeah, through various provincial organizations, we have that representation. So we are small. We have a lot of universities for a small province, and within the Atlantic Canadian context, we have research collaborations across. So I know where my people are, right? And that's common in academia that you would know. But we actually have a role to play, and it's sitting at the table with disability advocacy community members and First Voice members through the special education policy. At the provincial table, I sat there as the teacher education rep for 10 years, and now my colleague Cornelia Schneider is there. So we, you know, there's a couple of us at each institution that are informally connected, that are involved, that speak up, that participate in policy, that respond to media asks, and graduate study, you know, collaboration around graduate study and research projects. So that is a plus of being in a small place, is that you can make those connections.
So are the teachers that you are helping prepare your students for their work out in Nova Scotia schools, do they take the fact that their schools will be inclusive for granted? Is that something they just assume will be the case because they've gone to inclusive schools?
Yeah, I think it means something different for each of them. We have people from all over Canada in our BEd programs in Nova Scotia, but we have a large number of people from Nova Scotia. And, you know, as I get older and they get younger, it seems, then I think, you know, I take your point. They don't know what they haven't had. But I also am encouraged that they're looking deeper than placement. They're looking deeper than you know, a person has a learning disability or a person has a particular label. They're looking at the whole person and their culture and language and all of it, the multiple identities. I think that's, you know, that's a much better place to be than just thinking that we're into person fixing. So I think, you know, I say, yes, they may be taking it for granted, but they have other questions they want answered.
Okay, well, we keep our chats to about 30 minutes, and this one's gone very fast. So I'd like to thank you for joining us for this session, Lynn. And I know both Diane and I, having been involved a bit in your project or in the Luke Aylward situation, been particularly interested in that work you've done, and I commend you for it, along with Matt Rogers. And I think it'll be interesting to a lot of people, and we'll find a way to make sure they have the links to that within our communication network. So thank you so much for joining us, and take care.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.